All right. Hi, everyone. I'm here with Cyd Harrell, who is a leader in the civic design field. She's a civic design consultant, former chief of staff at 18F, and also an author of a book that just got released called A Civic Technologist Practice Guide. So welcome, Cyd.
Thanks so much, Roshen. It's good to see you.
Yeah, it's good to see you as well. I'd love to get kind of an update on everything you've been working on, especially during the pandemic. I know government's been really trying to focus on delivering services. So, what have you been up to?
I've continued along, with some long-term work, consulting with some California agencies, but I also did a couple of side projects I'm really proud of, in addition to publishing a whole book. So, um, I worked with the National Conference on Citizenship and New America in the first months of the pandemic on the team for this really interesting study headed by Dana Chisnell about what it was like for people to try to access safety net services like unemployment in those first months when everything kind of collapsed and so many people needed help. That was some of the most intense research I've ever worked on, and really interesting focus in that the point was to collect stories and bring them as quickly as possible in front of policymakers who are needing to understand what was going on and what they could and should do about it. There's some really cool material about that online, but another project I did on the side that was really interesting was working on the California Department of Technology strategy for the next few years. I was in an advisor role on that project, which was led by Dan Hahn, who runs Very Little Gravitas, another consulting agency. And we had a really interesting process interviewing California agency leaders and learning more about people's hopes and dreams and what happened when the state went remote as the pandemic turned on, and how that changed how people thought about what the state should be doing with tech and so forth. So I've been really lucky to be able to work from home and do remote research mostly throughout the pandemic. So while I am tired and battered like probably everybody,
Yeah.
it's been an interesting year from a research perspective.
Yeah, well, zoom out a little bit and tell us how you got into civic tech overall. And for those who might not know, what is civic tech?
Yeah, civic tech is sometimes called a movement, and is certainly a field, and it is about bringing the best, and plenty of argument about what the best is, of private sector tech skills and people and tools to public sector problems. So often that may mean working directly with government or in government. Sometimes it means working with companies that focus on the public sector. Sometimes it means volunteer work. But I think one of the things that makes something civic tech, as opposed to the slightly different term government tech, is that there's an explicit goal to build capacity for government to do better digital services or better digital work or better data work itself. So you kind of try to, if you are coming in from the outside in a short-term way, you're trying to leave the campsite, cleaner than you found it. Support your public sector, public servant hero partners with things that communities and practices that you may have long-term access to that they may not, and hopefully build something really useful also.
And what is GovTech versus civic tech?
I think GovTech is also about the government doing a great job with technology, but less concerned with the idea of innovation or with bringing new skills or private sector skills into the government's capacities. Pretty closely related, to be honest.
Yeah, they're definitely intertwined.
Yeah.
And then, yeah, how did you come to civic tech as a field?
So it's funny. I told a story for a long time that I had like a moment when I realized how important this was, and when that moment was sometime circa 2011, driving through Golden Gate Park on the way to a summer camp with my little daughter in the back, and her noticing that it was one of those foggy San Francisco mornings in June, and there was sprinklers on everywhere, which didn't make any sense, and saying, mommy, there's water all over the place. They're wasting it. That's terrible. What can we do? And not being able to figure out how to tell the kid, I don't know, we can't do anything, not being able to have any idea of who to call, but remembering that this group called Code for America that I'd heard of had helped SF put 311 on Twitter.
Mm.
And so sending a quick tweet and saying, sweetheart, we did this, here you go. And then discovering that I actually got a response, and starting to investigate why I, as a longtime designer, hadn't really thought about government as something that I could participate in professionally. But the truth is, when I looked back at my reality and my career history, a few years earlier, when I was part of this research firm called Volt Peters, during the 2009 pandemic, we had gotten this call from somebody at Stanford who was working with the CDC at that time, said, could you help us? We are working on a Google Sites template for local public health departments to put out vaccine information. And, we don't have any UX experts. Is there anything you all can do? We don't have any budget, but what kind of help can you give us? And so we got to do this really quick sprint. And that was really the first time that I considered a government problem like that. And that has so many features, in fact, of the sorts of problems that we address in Civic Tech. This is widely distributed set of counties that actually manage public health problems. It was a urgent issue, just like it is now. I don't think they were even trying in 2009 to set up vaccine appointment sites. They were just trying to notify people of what was available. But that was exciting. And the question of the sprinkler was exciting. And I began to look around and see that I could show up at these things called hackathons, and they sounded kind of engineering. And I was a little worried that I would get booted because I never have been an engineer at all. But I showed up with what I could do, and I showed teams how to do Flash user research, and I tried to help where I could. And I discovered a community that was working on problems that were really interesting. So I started doing some other things like mentoring Code for America fellows, and eventually that company was sold. You might remember Facebook had a spree of buying up design firms around 2012. And we were one of
You're
them.
talking about Bolt Peters being sold.
I'm talking about Volt Peters being sold. Yeah. So, So Facebook was buying every design firm that they could get their hands on, and they bought us. And I thought, do I want to go to Facebook, or is this a sign that maybe I should just invest in this civic tech direction that's been so interesting? And I decided on the latter. And I'm sure I am a few $100,000 the poorer because of it. But it's been amazing from just an intellectual and professional perspective to get to do this kind of work.
You mentioned kind of this, you slightly mentioned kind of cross jurisdictional collaboration. That's something Exygy is getting into with our affordable housing work. And we've seen whisperings of how that can like really benefit the counties that are collaborating, or potentially, I don't know, we don't do this right now, but even states. Have you seen that work well anywhere, or work across jurisdiction?
I define well. I don't think I've seen anywhere where it isn't hard, but I do think that it has been successful in some places. I actually think there are only 2 vaccine registration systems in use right now at the state level, I'm fairly sure. One of them is VAMS, which was created by the federal government with a consultant, and the other one, I'm going to forget the name of it, but it was created by a team in Maryland that was expert in vaccine distribution. And I believe that as those are being improved, there's a fair amount of collaboration going on. There are resources like the State Software Collective at the Beck Center at Georgetown, where they're really working to try and encourage and support more of that, because obviously it would save a lot of money and a lot of time and a lot of headaches if states could all have access to a suite of software that,
Yeah, that makes sense. I want to go back to the 2 projects you mentioned at the beginning. Tell us more about the research on pandemic unemployment that you're doing, and how you conducted it in this remote world, and what you learned.
It was fascinating. And I almost want to read you the names of everybody who was on it, because I was a team member, was pulled together by Dana Chisnell. And she, one of the things that was most interesting to me as a researcher was, you always hear the adage that you can basically have 2 of fast, cheap, and good. On this particular project, New America, which was supporting it, chose fast and good. So we had a team of 9 professional researchers to do this, and they were amazing people. And the idea was in 4 weeks to get as many stories as possible from Americans affected by unemployment or some other economic hardship from the pandemic, and understand what was happening, what were they doing, how are they trying to get help? If they couldn't get help from the government, where were they turning? Who might they be helping? What was that doing to their mental and physical health? In the form of stories. And so the study was really designed as collecting a story and having a conversation. Our recruitment team were amazing in pulling together a really diverse set of Americans across a bunch of states and backgrounds and previous work statuses and professions. They were some of the most intense research sessions I've done. People were really in dire circumstances, and we actually, Dana engaged some extra care for the team because some of the stories were so hard to hear. And some of the more mid-level folks on the team hadn't done research on really instantly life critical stuff before. And there's a different level of like, how do you engage and be receptive and also not end the day an absolute mess when you're doing something like that. So that, again, there were those resources. It was really well done. And then each researcher who did a session took it and massaged it into a 2 to 4 page story almost immediately, and shared it back with the participant and shared it with the group. And then every week, those were sent to policymakers as kind of a digest of here's the stories that we heard. And then with those 9 professionals, which was just so cool, we got to do this really intensive synthesis process where we used multiple methods and, combed through all of those interview transcripts and found every piece where someone described waiting, every piece where someone talked about a time element in their process of getting it. So we did kind of a traditional like issue-based synthesis, and then we did this one around time, and then we did one around metaphors and story genres to come up with our kind of canonical statement of what's going on here, which was that people are trapped in a game that they don't know how to play, and they definitely don't know how to win.
Yeah. And what was how did policymakers use that data or those stories?
They used it, I think, to make tries to get more help for people. And I don't know that they succeeded. And I also think that had more to do with the political circumstances at the time. But the other thing that happened was that Dana was able to publish all that methodology. So I think there's going to be a link attached to this podcast or something.
Yeah, we're happy to link to the stuff you did. And who's Dana Chisnell, for those who don't know?
Dana Chisnell is one of the greats of the civic design field. She was one of the founders of the Center for Civic Design and incredibly well-known and respected as a user researcher before that. So she was also one of the first into USDS when it was founded, and I believe has now gone back to the government as part of the new Biden administration. So someone whose work I have admired and gotten a chance to work with her a couple times in the last several years.
Yeah, something you're mentioning, listening to really tough stories of folks who are trying to access unemployment services, and something at Exygy we're always talking about is how to, do equitable research, have a diverse set of voices, but also, not be overburdening people, who are already in really tough situations. And I guess I'm curious about what was part of the recruiting team's ethos, or how you engaged with people that kind of respected their time as well, or brought them into the process. So it was interesting that you said you also shared the stories back with them and things like that.
Yeah, we wanted to do that. And we asked what they were comfortable with in terms of sharing. with policymakers, whether they were comfortable with a first name, et cetera. We also, of course, paid people. That was one of the other nice things about the resource and the fast and good.
Yeah.
And we did a practice that's, I think, moderately unusual in remote, which is we paid them immediately by whatever means they wanted.
Gotcha.
So if they had a Cash App or a Venmo or whatever, we just paid them and dealt with the admin on the back end, which I think I've never done that in terms of just a little technical research change. But I think that was really appropriate to the circumstances.
Versus like giving a gift card or something that
You're
tailoring
or
it
it'll
to
take us
whatever.
a week to get it out to you. It's like, no, we'll pay you, within 2 hours of doing the study for your time.
Yeah, that makes sense. Well, yeah, talk a little bit about your second project around state of California and technology strategy. I know state of California is still on its massive journey to integrate more, agile practices, all the best practices. What did you learn during that work?
Yeah, that was fascinating because we got to talk a lot to people who were either agency leaders or state employees about what the pandemic had been like.
And sorry, what was the mandate of that project? Maybe just give people a background. Yeah.
Yes. So my colleague, Dan Hahn, who I work with sometimes, leads a company called Very Little Gravitas that was contracted to develop a 3-year strategy for the California Department of Technology. So what does the California Department of Technology need to do, and what should it be aiming at by 2023?
Okay.
The focus was on, well, how are people using technology to accomplish their missions, and how are barriers in technology holding them back from accomplishing as much of their missions as they would like? A lot of interesting stuff came out of what had happened when the pandemic happened and the state had to go remote in a matter of a few days for almost everybody who worked in an office out of all, 230,000 or 270,000. I'm forgetting the number, but California has a lot of employees. And it was one of the things we did was a pretty broad survey of employees and discovered that most people were up and running in days, remote from home.
Right.
But there are still some places where broadband in the state of California doesn't cover every area. So there are people who had difficulties of just internet access and access to tools, laptop configurations for remote working. A lot of people didn't have cameras to do video calls. We looked at, where collaboration gets stuck between different departments, sometimes just because of tools. And then we looked at kind of aspirationally, what does the state want to be doing in terms of digital services and in terms of having a resident-centered perspective in a lot of what it does. So it's actually a pretty extensive website, and there's a research document on there that's a pretty long document. But it was a really, really interesting set of people to talk to, and definitely an honor to be a part of that project.
Yeah. What were some of the many insights or little actionable steps that came out of it, or were suggested at least?
Yeah, no, it's interesting. I mean, so some of the biggest things are that, if you want to take that old quote that the future is unevenly distributed, like the future of tech is unevenly distributed across different government departments. And at some point, the state is going to have to sort of pause thinking about faster innovation and get all of the departments the ability to do the basics, meaning online collaboration and easy remote working. And also, things that a business expects to be able to do these days, like put up a website landing page or, put up a quick dashboard with some data that it owns without having to contract out through a procurement process for all of those types of things. So that was a pretty interesting recommendation. There was some stuff around collaboration tech and how to make that work. We referenced the new data strategy for the state by the CDO, Joy Bonaguro, and her team, which I think is a really interesting building block.
Yeah. and zooming out even further, because I know you've just published this book called The Civic Technologist Practice Guide. Like, um, I'm interested in kind of what the book focuses on. I know it's about how designers can like really get into civic technology, understand government. What are some of the things that you decided to write upon?
So I wanted to write just kind of a grounding document, and hopefully, one of the early books on what I really hope will be a whole shelf of books about civic tech. So for anybody who, is in the private sector now and wants to work in the public sector, or who is in the public sector and wants a sort of, hopefully a shared set of vocabulary to just talk about and have useful arguments about this work. I wanted to kind of lay out, okay, when we talk about American government, what do you need to know? What do we need to be careful about as people, coming in from something of a privileged field of technology, whatever other privileges we're carrying? And then what's the work actually like? What should you expect? What kinds of projects happen? What are different ways that you can partner, and what do you need to know about the types of people you encounter? What are the long-term sticky problems that you might contribute to solving, but that are really going to be out there for a long time? And then, at the end, I have my last two chapters are about harmonizing tech and government ways of working, and about taking care of ourselves in long-term work of this sort.
Yeah. It seems like I know in the civic field, there's the work of it, which might be as a designer or whatever practitioner you are as an engineer. And then there's everything surrounding the work, which I feel like is the stuff you're focusing on, like the people and the types of projects and the approaches and all the stuff that comes outside of it.
Sort of also is the work, and that
which is the work,
hand-on keyboard work without doing all of that. And you should know that if you're going to come into the field, like you can't just come in and like be like, yes, I am really good at making web components with great design, and really change an organization.
Right. Yeah, that's something I think we talk a lot to people who are interested in even joining our team that are coming from the private sector, that like, working in the social sector or public sector, the work is all these other pieces as well, in addition to the product design, technology, everything. I also was talking to a friend the other day who does public sector work, who I was realizing that the designers in government are, and I don't know if you will think this is true, so I'm kind of curious if you think it's true, are policymakers. Like they're the ones designing, whether it's a housing program or a benefits program, whatever it is. And agencies at whatever level are tasked with delivering on those programs and services. And so like, I don't know, it's interesting to be a designer in the civic space when there's another role that is also kind of a designer of government.
No, I agree. And there are a lot of people trying to think about how to meld policy and design. And, clearly there are some design methods that are sometimes useful to policy design,
right?
But it's also a whole field in its own right. Policy implementation, though, is a really interesting space for tech and design to play. I think we can all probably think of examples of policies that were really well intended and then failed on the implementation.
Right.
Healthcare.gov, if you want to be really obvious about it, that kind of launched a lot of the bigger national civic tech movement in the US, because it was like, wait, the president's top policy priority can go down in flames because of a website.
Right. Yeah. And I think that's spot on, that like design and technology can help in policy delivery. And I think in a bit, there's starting to be an evaluation as well. So like if you're delivering a service, like, is it having the intended impact that the policymakers intended, and like doing some of that feedback loop back to the policymaker. But I think government isn't yet set up for policymaking to be a feedback loop as much as like tech is.
No, I don't think so. And then you sort of see it as an analogy to tech and try to figure out where does it fit and where does it doesn't. Or that was awkward grammar.
It's been a year of a pandemic. That's where we're at. Well, yeah, I want to kind of wrap up with I know you've mentioned a lot of different reports and stuff you put out, which we'll definitely put as links for people. Are there any resources you would point people to for designers who are trying to build in the public space and are also specifically trying to focus on, equitable, ethical builds and design work?
Absolutely. I think the Creative Reaction Lab out of St.
Mm.
Louis has a number of terrific resources. Their Equity Centered Community Design Guide, along with some other things. If you're just looking for Civic Tech projects, there's the guide put out by Civic Hall, which I think is at civictech.guide.
Okay.
That has an enormous list of projects around the world. And then I know we designers don't always think of ourselves in Code for X type spaces, but the Code for America Brigade Network is in an awful lot of cities, and you might be able to find a place pretty near you to meet with like-minded folks and see what kind of problems are available for designers to contribute on.
Great. And how can people follow you, contact you, get in touch with you?
Like a lot of designers, I'm on Twitter more than I should be, so that is a great place. I'm at Cyd Harrell. I'm pretty much the only Cyd Harrell on the internet.
Sounds great. All right, Cyd. Well, thanks so much for taking the time to talk with me.
Thank you, Roshen. It was great to talk to you.